Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Bertrand, and I am pre-recording my presentation for the 2021 Creative Bridges Conference in the event we have any technical or other issues on the day of the event. In my presentation, These Roots That Bind Us, I will be sharing an overview of my autoethnographic research on the use of creative writing in response to a chronic illness diagnosis. Before we begin, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement in recognition of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I am privileged to work and live on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Nahiawak, Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Anishinaabe, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. In my presentation today, we will kick things off with a short poll to get a sense of attendee experiences with chronic illness. I will then provide an overview of my research with a focus on key findings and takeaways that may be useful for attendees. Finally, we will wrap up with a short discussion to allow participants to engage with the presentation content. Since this is a pre-recording today, I will share these slides, but viewers of the recording will be asked to consider the poll and discussion topics on their own time. So to get things started, our poll asks you to consider your current experience with chronic illness as a way to situate yourself within the presentation context, including whether you are managing your own chronic illness, have a family member, friend, or colleague with a chronic illness, work with clients or patients who live with chronic illness, and/or do not have any experience with chronic illness. Please take a moment to consider your responses. I chose to carry out my research to explore my own chronic illness and how writing might be used to support healing. Chronic illness diagnoses frequently cause the shattering of our personal assumptions about the self and the world around us, resulting in an experience of alienation and fragmentation of identity. Multiple studies on the effects of expressive writing have demonstrated physical, emotional, and psychological health benefits. Yet little is known about how it might offer benefit in response to a chronic illness diagnosis. Combining the transformation through writing model with the dual process model for non-death loss and grief, I explore how creative writing about fibromyalgia assisted me to understand the alienation and fragmentation experienced following diagnosis. It also led to improvements in my emotional and psychological health in relation to living with a chronic illness. I conclude that writing about chronic illness allows ill individuals to move from a first story or loss orientation to a second story or restoration orientation as part of a dialogical process of self-reconstruction. Fibromyalgia is a chronic invisible illness characterized by widespread musculoskeletal pain and heightened pain response, and accompanied by fatigue, sleep, memory, and mood complications. I found that writing about my illness ultimately led to a profound shift in my perspective of illness from an enemy to a protector. In the next slides, I will provide some theoretical context for my research, followed by excerpts and explanations from my own creative writing. When I mentioned our personal assumptions earlier, I was referencing Park's definition of our assumptive world and building upon Bowlby's concept of internal working models. Our assumptive world is a strongly held set of assumptions about the world and the self, which is confidently maintained and used as a means of recognizing, planning, and acting. Both Bowlby and Parks note that loss can threaten this assumptive world we create for ourselves. Janef Bowman identifies 3 assumptions that form this conceptual system in early childhood. The world is benevolent, the world is meaningful, and the self is worthy. Harris revises this framework so that the assumptions can be applied more broadly. Our conceptual system includes assumptions about how we tend to view others and their intentions, how we believe the world should work, and how we tend to view ourselves. Loss, then, is a highly personal experience and may occur when a life event challenges our assumptions in such a way that we lose our sense of security, predictability, and meaning or purpose. Walsh identifies loss of health as one of 3 key changes likely to alter life so radically as to make it utterly recognizable and impossible to return to anything resembling its former state. In short, illness shatters our assumptive world. In Table 1, I have used Harris's revised conceptual model to map my own mental shifts following diagnosis of fibromyalgia and to identify the anxieties I experienced in relation to acknowledging my illness. These anxieties primarily involved concerns regarding the perception of others and my sense of self or purpose. My diagnosis and the shattering of my assumptive world raised difficult questions about my relationships, work, purpose, and identity, and I needed to find a way to process the grief of my losses. Harris argues that grief is both adaptive and necessary in order to rebuild the assumptive world after its destruction from significant loss experiences. Adapting Strobe and Schutt's framework for coping with bereavement, Harris presents a dual process model for non-death loss and grief that conceptualizes the grief process as an oscillation between immersion in the loss experience or loss orientation and attempts to restore identity and functioning or the restoration orientation. Interestingly, this model aligns well with the transformation through writing model posited by Lengel and Mayers. In this model, we use writing to process a boundary experience, which is a serious challenge to our self-concept. Writing allows us to engage affectively with lived experience, observe the self with some detachment, and go through 4 nonlinear cognitive learning stages intended to move us to new livable narratives that represent shifts in perspective, finding acceptance, or constructing new meanings. As we honor our feelings while also allowing ourselves to move out of our first story, we can begin to analyze and view our first story from different angles. In my research, I overlay the transformation through writing model and dual process model to propose a hybrid model that demonstrates an approach to processing non-death loss and grief through writing. As shown in this slide, we begin with a boundary experience, the non-death loss, move from a first story in which we are stuck or suffering into a loss orientation, and create a second story following attempts to restore equilibrium, ideally with progress towards new perspectives, rebuilding, and increasing awareness of possibilities. The cognitive stages contemplated by Lengel and Mayers also align with the grieving process as we explore and describe our emotions, called sensing, compare our circumstances with those of others to develop analogies, constructs, and concepts, called sifting, attempt to bring together our feelings and ideas about our losses, or focusing, and finally formulate a new narrative based on these insights, or understanding. In essence, the loss orientation and restoration orientation describe what we might experience as we oscillate between different stages and feelings associated with grief. And the transformation through writing cycle demonstrates how we can purposefully navigate this experience through a reflective writing practice. When applied to a chronic illness diagnosis, we see how writing might support us to move through an ever-widening spiral of self-awareness as we confront our losses and seek to restore the wholeness of a fragmented self and body. My first attempt to put my feelings about illness in writing resulted in the following poem, which I called Nightbird, a portrait of self. There is this me and that me, one strong, willing, the other broken, limp. The disjointed structure of the poem highlights the fragmentation I felt at that time between former healthy self and new ill self, and between functioning mind and failing body. The mechanical and synthetic imagery of the clockwork bird and cyborg bird reflect the growing alienation I felt from my own body, a robotic other subject to breaking down and functioning outside of my control. I make attempts in the poem to reconcile myself with this change, to find something positive. For example, recast in shining metals, bright jewels, or more machine than flesh, but whole again, connected to the world beyond. But in the end, I acknowledge that I am broken and cannot be restored through these alien forms. The final stanza offers hope for my own metamorphosis into something new, where brokenness might be an advantage and allow for escape from what I viewed as the prison of my body. The metaphor of a split self is common in illness narratives. Fragmentation and disassociation recur as frightening but also self-protective devices. In this untitled poem, the disconnection I feel from my body is clear. It is an alien terrain, a kind of molten, otherworldly yet visceral landscape. In her exploration of how we encode traumatic memories, McCurdy identifies iconic images, the sensory, emotional, and often deeply buried mental pictures produced by trauma. Although I am not using McCurdy's concept in the same context here, her notion that once we can access the iconic image, we can connect with the experience that generated the image has relevance to illness metaphors. Knitting or weaving recurs in my writing about fibromyalgia. According to Gibbs, insertion or application of sharp objects is a common metaphor used to describe pain. Although the image of needles piercing the flesh here is violent, I actually felt empowered writing this, as if I could wield a tool in this imaginary space to lessen or eradicate the pain and regain some form of agency over my experience. The references to macrame and knitting also recall the connection to reconstruction following shattered assumptions, the idea of weaving or creating a new version of self by actively untwisting my ill body. As I continued to explore my fibromyalgia through writing, I naturally began to adopt different voices or characters in relation to illness. These voices or characters may also be called I positions in reference to the complex, multi-voiced, narratively structured self described in Herman's dialogical self theory. Within my imaginal mental landscape, I was able to move spatially and temporally between positions, adopt different and opposing positions, and imaginatively give each position a voice to establish dialogical relations between them. Specific to illness narratives, this type of dialogue with self typically occurs through metaphor. Kermeyer argues that metaphorization can contribute to healing by offering room to maneuver imaginative possibilities, behavioral options, and rhetorical supplies. Building on this concept, Gibbs suggests that metaphor can provide unique psychological and biological insights into the illness experience as people imagine themselves in different real-world or fantastic situations. In this untitled poem, I take on the voice of my illness in the form of a dialogue with self. It is important to note that I did not set out to write in the voice of my illness. This perspective emerged spontaneously, and the results surprised me. Instead of an alien presence or enemy, my illness took the form of a protector or guide trying to remind me of the value of self-care and simplicity. There is still a tension here or an opposition, but it takes the form of an opposing viewpoint, offering a different perspective on my illness. As Frank writes in his 1991 illness narrative, I had stopped resenting my body for the pain, and started to consider what my body could still do for me. This shift in perspective demonstrates the power of writing to invite new insights and understanding in the face of our most challenging life experiences. The metaphorization and self-dialogue that emerged in my writing is perhaps at its most powerful in my short story, These Roots That Bind Us, scribbled down following a vivid dream sequence in which a group of women kneel around the body of their ailing daughter and weave together a bower of living roots. The women in this story are the ones in pain. The daughter is almost a secondary character, although she is the focus of the women's work. The roots are toxic and shred the women's hands, yet they continue to weave despite the painful lacerations and the loss of feeling in their legs, the aching in their necks and arms and backs. As the story progresses, the purpose of the weaving is revealed. The roots will build a duplicate bower next to the daughter and create a clone. The life of the original daughter is not guaranteed. When the healing is complete and the roots begin to retract, one body will remain, either their daughter or the duplicate created by the roots. They cannot predict who the roots will choose. If their daughter will become food for the earth and her copy will emerge, similar in sound and appearance, but forever changed. In this short story, similar metaphors such as weaving and split selves, characters such as protectors, and imagery, both visceral and alien, reappear. However, the split self concept that first emerged in my poem Nightbird has become a more complex form of doubling. In Gothic literature, the genre that might best describe my story, the double tends to represent the divided psyche. Freud argued that the double may take on different meanings, not only a harbinger of death, but an object separated from the ego as a means of self-observation and self-criticism, and a representation of all those unfulfilled but possible futures to which we still like to cling in fantasy. In her extended study of death and femininity, Bronfen highlights how Freud's definition captures the depiction of the double in literature as a symbol of the divided self. Doubling involves the subject's identification with another, the substitution of the alternate self for the subject, or the inability of the subject to decide between two versions of the self. It is a split or gap and signifies that something that was whole and unique has been split into more than one part. The intent of this brief detour into the origins of the Gothic double is to elaborate on the purpose of doubling in my own story. The clone of the daughter represents an acknowledgement that illness has created an alienation from self and a fragmentation of self and body. While I initially positioned a split in the form of unfamiliar or strange creatures, the clockwork or cyborg bird, terrains, such as the otherworldly landscape, and characters, such as illness personified, I now envisioned this split in human form and asserted that only one, the daughter or her clone, would remain when the roots retracted. This was a recognition, I think, of transformation and perhaps a potential return to wholeness. Adding the process of adapting to impairment outlined by Sharmas to my proposed hybrid model discussed earlier in the presentation, I can summarize my exploration of chronic illness through writing as follows. First, experiencing and defining my illness through imagery and metaphor to develop an awareness of my feelings of fragmentation and alienation. And secondly, assessing my body and exploring identity by adopting different characters and voices and formulating new perspectives. Sharmas also contemplates a final step in this adaptation process, surrendering to the sick self by relinquishing control over illness and by flowing with the experience of it. Surrender here does not mean giving up. Rather, the ill person learns to let go, to struggle with rather than against illness, and reunify self and body. In this final poem I will share today, I see the beginnings of the surrender and restoration of wholeness in my own illness narrative. I am the voice of myself and my illness here. We are one, the weaver and the woven. While the weight of the skein is a heavy load to carry, it is a comforting and warm significance. Though the process of knitting is messy and fraught with errors, it sometimes results in rows of perfect rightness. In this process of rebirth, of continually weaving and dissolving, I have found moments of wonder and possibility and a sense of meaning. Sharmas writes that chronic illness takes people on an odyssey of self, but in this poem, I think of Penelope rather than Odysseus, patiently weaving and unraveling Laertes' shroud to retain her sense of agency and hope. Hawkins notes that many pathographers use mythic constructions to frame their experience of illness. Weaving goddesses and myths, for example, can be found across culture, although the more specific mythic references in my own poetry are likely the result of my academic and literary interests. Regardless of the myths or metaphors employed, surrendering to my illness moved me closer to healing the grief associated with my chronic illness diagnosis and helped me to integrate my illness into a new master narrative in which my condition is a source of meaning and a reaffirmation of life. In closing, I suggest considering the stages of adapting to impairment outlined by Sharmas to further clarify the cognitive stages that occur when writing about chronic illness, as shown earlier in Figure 2. Through writing and reflecting on the results, with special attention to the metaphors and characters used to explore the experience of illness, the ill person may shift from a first story or loss orientation to a second story or restoration orientation as many times as necessary to process grief and adapt to changing circumstances. My purpose in elaborating on the transformation through writing model and dual process model for non-death loss and grief is to conceptualize how the oscillation between a loss orientation and restoration orientation may relate to the cognitive processes at work when writing about chronic illness, as well as to identify what focused therapeutic writing approaches might adopt in this context to support the ill person's movement from alienation and fragmentation to restoration of wholeness and the potential for self-transformation. In Table 2, I provide sample writing prompts based on Figure 2 and my own writing experience, which may be helpful for practitioners to use or adapt when working with clients to process a chronic illness diagnosis through writing. My writing on chronic illness over the course of about 3 years demonstrates a gradual progression towards a new level of self-awareness through multiple oscillations between first stories or loss orientations and second stories or restoration orientations. In comparison to the uncertainty, anger, and fear outlined in Table 1, my poetry and fiction allowed me to explore and define my experience of fibromyalgia in such a way that I better understand my illness and feel comfortable sharing my diagnosis with others, try out different perspectives to resolve questions of identity and reunify my fragmented self and body, and begin a hopeful process of meaning making within my new circumstances. I would also like to note, however, a few limitations in relation to my autoethnographic analysis of the benefits of creative writing for chronic illness. In reflecting upon my positionality, I have an openness to disclosure about my lived experience, which may not be the case for individuals with different cultural attitudes, in particular those who avoid disclosure as a means of protecting physical and mental health. In addition, the effects of writing following a chronic illness diagnosis must be tested over time and in relation to different forms and stages of illness. The relapses typically associated with chronic illness mean that ill persons are in a continual state of revising assumptions and restoring coherence, sometimes in the context of worsening symptoms and more acute health crises. Moreover, my writing is specific to the experience of invisible illness, which has a particular social context and relationship to cultural dis-ease, has a connection to stress, buried trauma, and related triggers, and involves an ongoing conflict between experiencing illness, the internal, but not always appearing ill, the external. Nevertheless, I hope my autoethnographic analysis of the metaphors and mechanisms at work when writing about illness may contribute to our understanding of the benefits of creative writing for physical, emotional, and psychological health, and offer a starting point for further research. To wrap up the presentation today, attendees are asked to have a brief discussion about their experiences in using writing in relation to chronic illness, or their key takeaways from today's session. Since this is a pre-recording, I will ask viewers to consider these questions on their own time. Thank you for watching this recording today. I hope you found something valuable to consider in your own writing or practice. A limited number of full text copies of my research paper are available through the link on this slide. This link will also provide you with a list of the references noted in the presentation. If you have any questions or would like to share your ideas or research with me, please contact me at the email address noted on the slide. Thanks again.